Hello everybody, welcome to a new video. Today I am showing you guys who is the best offensive and defensive player for each team. Some may have multiple selections. If you have any recommendations on future videos like this, comment it down below. This is based off my opinion, so sorry if you disagree. If you do disagree, write it down below on what player you thought was better than what I had. Without further ado, let's get started. Starting off with the Atlanta Falcons. I was originally going to pick Kirk Cousins until he threw all those picks and got benched for Michael Penix Jr. Instead, I went with Bijan Robinson. Bijan has almost 1,200 yards rushing, and he has 10 rushing touchdowns. He averages 4.6 yards per carry, and I think he is the future running back for the Atlanta Falcons. Going over to the defensive side, I think Jessie Bates and Kaden Eylis are both good options. Kaden is the leader in tackles and sacks, while Jessie Bates is the leader in interceptions. Both of these players are really good, and they have some potential to be better. That is why I chose them as the best defensive players for the Atlanta Falcons. The next team is the Carolina Panthers. They have been looking pretty good recently, but they still aren't that good. I decided to go with Chuba Hubbard instead of Bryce Young. Even though Bryce Young has been looking good recently, he has less than 2,000 yards passing and almost has the same number of interceptions and touchdowns. Meanwhile, Chuba has almost 1,200 yards and he has 10 touchdowns. He basically has the same stats as Bijan Robinson, but Chuba plays with the worst offensive line and an overall worse team than the Falcons. Sorry, Panthers fans. That is why I chose Chuba as the best offensive player for the Panthers. Next is the defense. Xavier Words has looked promising. He is the leader of tackles and interceptions for his team. Even though he has no sacks, he still has 3 interceptions and 102 tackles. That is why I chose him as the best defensive player for the Panthers. The next team is my favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. The Saints have been hit with injuries just like the Rams, Lions, and 49ers. But Alvin Kamara and Derek Carr have looked the best. Alvin is the leader in rushing and receiving yards. He has 950 yards rushing and 543 yards receiving. For some people, the stats may suck, but he has been a really good running back. Derek Carr, even though he has been hurt, has 2,145 passing yards and 15 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions. When he was playing, especially in the first 2 weeks, he has looked pretty good. That's why I chose him as the best offensive players for the Saints. On to the defense, I was going to choose Marshawn Lattimore, but he got traded to the Washington Commanders. Instead, I went with Demario Davis. He is the leader in tackles on this team, and he has 6 blocked passes. Another good option is Alontae Taylor. He is second in blocks, he has 4 sacks, 33 sack yards, and is the leader of passes defended or deflected with 14. That is why I chose them as the best defensive players for the Saints. The next team is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They are fighting with the Atlanta Falcons to win the NFC South. I think Baker Mayfield is the best offensive player for the Bucs. Baker is only 80 yards away from 4,000 passing yards, and he has 34 passing touchdowns. He threw 15 interceptions, which is a lot, but he had a lot of passing touchdowns. That is why I chose Baker Mayfield as the best offensive player for the Bucs. On to the defensive side, I chose Lavonte David as the best defensive player for the Bucs. He is the leader in tackles and third in sacks. He only has 1 interception, but it doesn't mean that he's a bad player. He is pretty good, and that is why I chose him as the best defensive player for the Bucs. The next team is the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys season is awful, but they looked pretty good recently. Other than that, they aren't doing that good. The focus should be all in the draft. Anyways, CeeDee Lamb is the best offensive player for the Cowboys. CeeDee almost has 1,200 yards receiving when playing with Cooper Rush and Dak Prescott. He also has 6 touchdowns. He is a very good wide receiver, and that is why I chose CeeDee Lamb as the best offensive player for the Cowboys. On to the defensive side, I was going to choose Eric Kendricks, but instead I went for the sack leader, Micah Parsons. Eric would be another good pick, but Micah has been looking good for a while. Micah has 2 forced fumbles and 9.5 sacks. He is the leader of this inconsistent defense. That is why I chose Micah as the best defensive player for the Cowboys. Next team is the New York Giants. Their season has been very disappointing, and they are on their 4th string quarterback. They released Daniel Jones, and they are just ready for the season to be over. The rookie, Malik Nabers, exceeded expectations and is almost at 1,000 yards. You may be thinking, that kinda sucks, but he played with Daniel Jones, Drew Lock, Tommy DeVito, and Tim Boyle. Malik may be struggling right now, but he is the best offensive player for the Giants. On the defensive side, we have 2 great options for the best defensive player for the Giants. Since I can't choose, Brian Burns and Dexter Lawrence are the best defensive players. Dexter has more sacks with 9, but Brian Burns has more tackles and sack yards. They are both really good players and play in an underrated Giants defense, well, in my opinion, and that is why I chose them as the best defensive players for the Giants. The next team is the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles are doing really well, especially with Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts. Saquon, being a new addition to this already stacked Eagles offense, has made it a lot better than it already was. He has over 1,800 rushing yards and a total of 15 touchdowns in his first season as an Eagle. Jalen Hurts has almost 3,000 passing yards and almost 700 rushing yards. He has more rushing touchdowns than Saquon because of the famous move, the tush push. That is why I chose them as the best players in this Eagles offense. On the defensive side, this took me a while for me to decide. I eventually went with both Zach Bond and Josh Sweat. Zach is the leader in tackles for the Eagles and second in tackles for loss. Josh Sweat is the leader in sacks and sack yards. He is tied for third in tackles for loss on his team. Overall, this Eagles defense is pretty good, and that is why I went with those 2 people as the best in the Eagles defense. Next team is the Washington Commanders. The Commanders are one of the most surprising teams of this year. One person in particular was the most surprising. Jayden Daniels is probably the best rookie quarterback in the 2024 season. He leads the team in passing yards with 3,303 yards and rushing yards with 737. He has 22 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. He led his team to a winning record and probably a playoff berth. That is why I chose Jayden Daniels as the best offensive player for the Commanders. On the defensive side, it was a little harder. There was Bobby Wagner, Frankie Louvu, but instead I went with the sacks leader, Dante Fowler Jr. Dante has 9.5 sacks and 64 sack yards, both leading the Commanders team. He also has a pick 6 and a forced fumble. He is a great player with a great defense. That is why I chose Dante Fowler as the best defensive player for the Commanders. The next team is the Chicago Bears. Their season has been bad. Brutal losses, the bad coaching, to that one timeout from the Lions game. You could still call it. Their season has been a bumpy road. This offensive pick may be controversial, but there's literally no one else. Caleb Williams is the best offensive player for the Bears. DJ Moore has only 880 receiving yards, and DeAndre Swift has only 894 rushing yards. Caleb, on the other hand, has 3,393 passing yards and 19 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. Besides that awful Thursday night game against the Seattle Seahawks, he has looked decent. Hopefully next season is better for Bears and Caleb Williams. Meanwhile, the defense was more interesting. I decided to go with Montez Sweat as the best in the Chicago Bears defense. He has 5.5 sacks, which is leading the team, and 38 sack yards, also leading the team. He also has 2 forced fumbles, which is pretty good. That is why I went with Montez Sweat as the best defensive player for the Bears. The next team is the Lions. They are arguably the best team in football. These 2 players have been amazing. Jahmyr Gibbs has almost 1,200 rushing yards. He has 12 rushing touchdowns and 3 receiving touchdowns. Talking about receiving, Amon-Ra St. Brown is the other pick as the best offensive player for the Lions. Amon-Ra has almost 1,200 receiving yards and he has 11 receiving touchdowns. Another good pick would have been Jared Goff, but I like to shout out other positions in the stacked Lions offense. That is why I chose him as the best offensive players for the Lions. On to the defense, we have two really good options. We have Aiden Hutchinson. He is the leader in sacks for his team, even when he got injured mid-season. Sorry, Lions fans. And sack yards. The other good defensive player is Kirby Joseph. He is by far the leader in interceptions on his team with 7, one of them being a pick 6. Those two players are amazing, and that is why I chose them as the best defensive players for the Lions. The next team is the Green Bay Packers. The Packers season is going well. The most recent game, they shut out the New Orleans Saints. One person in the offense is doing amazing. Josh Jacobs has multiple 3-touchdown games and is looking like the future running back for the Packers. He has over 1,200 rushing yards and 13 rushing touchdowns. He also has a receiving touchdowns. Some may argue that Jordan Love would be the best, but I went with Josh Jacobs instead. That is why I picked Josh Jacobs as the best offensive player for the Packers. To the defensive side, I think Xavier McKinney is the best defensive player for the Packers. He had a streak of interceptions through different games. In total, he has 7 interceptions, which is leading the team. He also has a fumble recovery and a sack. That is why I chose Xavier McKinney as the best defensive player for the Packers. The next team is the Minnesota Vikings. This team, just like the Commanders, is one of the most surprising teams this year in the NFL. Sam Darnold is probably the most surprising. He has more than 3,500 passing yards and he has 32 touchdowns to 11 interceptions. Sam's favorite target, Justin Jefferson, is another pick for the best player for the Minnesota Vikings offense. Justin has almost 1,400 yards receiving and 10 receiving touchdowns. Aaron Jones would be a good pick, but Justin Jefferson and Sam Darnold are way better, and that is why I chose them as the best players for the Minnesota Vikings offense. Next is the Minnesota Vikings defense. This one defensive player has 2 pick sixes, 11 sacks, 73 sack yards, and a forced fumble. Andrew Van Ginkel has probably some of the best stats in the whole NFL. Both of his interceptions were pick sixes, and 11 sacks is a lot. That is why I went with Andrew Van Ginkel as the best defensive player for the Minnesota Vikings. Arizona Cardinals is the next team on my list. They had a mid-season and they just got eliminated from the playoffs. James Conner, though, is playing really well right now. Some may argue that Kyler Murray or Trey McBride would be better options, but Kyler has only 16 throwing touchdowns and Trey has less than 1,000 yards receiving. They aren't bad players, they just aren't as good as James Conner. James Conner has almost 1,100 rushing yards, and he has 8 rushing touchdowns. He also has a receiving touchdown. That is why I went with James Conner as the best offensive player for the Cardinals. Now on to the defense. Budda Baker is the best defensive player for the Cardinals. He is leading his team in tackles with 148. He only has 2 sacks, but the sack yards were 13. This one was pretty tough to decide, but that is why I went with Budda Baker as the best defensive player for the Cardinals. Next team is the Los Angeles Rams. Their last 2 games have been awful, but some games were amazing. Kyren Williams and Matthew Stafford are my picks for the best offensive players for the Rams. Kyren has almost 1,250 rushing yards and 13 rushing touchdowns. Kyren looks amazing, and I think he might be one of the best running backs this year. Matthew Stafford has been a pretty good quarterback, besides the last 2 weeks. He's thrown for almost 3,600 yards and 20 touchdowns, only 8 interceptions. That is why I chose them as the best offensive players for the Rams. Now it's the defense. Jalen McCollough and Kobe Turner are my picks. Jalen has the most interceptions on his team with 4. One of the 4 was a pick 6. Kobe is the sacks leader on his team with 7, and he has a fumble recovery. He also has 4 passes defended. That is why I chose them as the best defensive players for the Rams. Next team is the San Francisco 49ers. They have been hit with so many injuries. Christian McCaffrey got hurt. Brandon Ayuk got hurt. Even Jordan Mason got hurt. But Brock Purdy has looked pretty good. He has thrown for almost 3,500 yards and 17 touchdowns to 10 interceptions. Some may argue that George Kittle would be a better pick, but he hasn't reached 1,000 yards yet. Brock running the ball, he has the most rushing touchdowns on his team. That is why I chose Brock Purdy as the best offensive player for the 49ers. Now, the defense's turn. Fred Warner is the leader in tackles on his team with 117 and interceptions with 2. Leonard Floyd would be another good option. He is the leader in sacks on his team with 8.5 and has looked amazing. That is why I chose him as the best defensive players in the 49ers team. The next team is the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks season has been pretty interesting. They are like a roller coaster, up and down. Jackson Smith-Njigba has been up most of the time. Jackson has 1,121 yards receiving and 6 touchdowns. He's basically earned the wide receiver 1 spot. DK Metcalf kind of fell down a bit, but he is still doing well. That is why I chose Jackson as the best offensive player for the Seahawks. Now it's the defense. Julian Love has been looking amazing. Remember that one game where the Seahawks blocked a field goal? Well, that play was Julian Love. He is the leader in tackles and 3rd in interceptions on his team. He has 2 forced fumbles, and one of them he recovered. He has looked amazing, and that is why I chose him as the best defensive player for the Seahawks. Okay, this is the half point of the video. If you enjoyed this so far, make sure to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss future football content. Now, let's move on to the AFC teams, starting with the Buffalo Bills. The Bills are looking like the best team in the AFC. Josh Allen is looking like an MVP. He has almost 3,600 passing yards and 26 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. On the ground, he has 514 rushing yards and 11 rushing touchdowns. In total, he has over 4,000 yards and 37 touchdowns. He is looking amazing, and that is why I choose him as the best offensive player for the Bills. It is the defense. Greg Rousseau is my pick. He is the sacks leader on his team with 7.5. He also has 3 forced fumbles, and one of them he recovered. The Bills' defense has been okay, but Greg is the leader on this Bills' defense. Well, in my opinion. And that is why I chose him as the best defensive player for the Bills. The next team is the Miami Dolphins. This was probably the hardest team to do. I eventually decided to go with Tyreek Hill and Jonnu Smith. Yes, I know neither of them hit 1,000 yards, but Tua barely has any touchdowns. None of the running backs have 800 yards, and they have been looking really well recently. That is why I went with Tyreek and Jonnu as the best offensive players for the Dolphins. Now we have to do the defense. This one was pretty interesting. We once again have 2 players, Jordyn Brooks and Zach Sieler. Jordyn Brooks is the leader in tackles for the Dolphins with 128, and he has 3 sacks. Jordyn also has 2 fumble recoveries. Zach is the leader in sacks for his team with 8.5. Zach also has an interception and a fumble recovery. That is why I chose him as the best defensive players for the Dolphins. The next team is the New York Jets. The Jets have a lot of talent, but just don't know how to use it. Sorry, Jets fans. Probably because their Madden ratings are too low. With all jokes aside, I pick Aaron Rodgers as the best offensive player for the Jets. Aaron threw for more than 3,500 yards and 24 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. My pick may be controversial, but none of the wide receivers reach 1,000 yards yet, and the running backs didn't even reach 800 yards. That is why I chose Aaron Rodgers as the best offensive player for the Jets. Now it's the Jets' defense. Will McDonald IV is a great choice. He is by far leading his team in sacks with 10. He also has a fumble recovery. He is one of the best in his position, and that is why I chose him as the best defensive player from the Jets. Is the New England Patriots. The Patriots have had a very awful season, but Drake May looks promising. Ramondre Stevenson is way better though. He has exactly 800 rushing yards and 7 touchdowns. Drake May threw only 14 touchdowns to 10 interceptions. That is why I chose Ramondre Stevenson instead of Drake May for the best offensive player for the Patriots. For the defense, Jahlani Tavai is my pick. Jahlani is the leader in tackles for his team with 104. He has a sack and an interception. He is second in tackles for loss with 7. He is looking pretty good, and that is why I choose him as the best defensive player for the Patriots. The next team is the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens just became AFC North division leaders, and they are looking really good. Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry are looking amazing. Lamar has almost 4,000 passing yards and 39 passing touchdowns to only 4 interceptions. Lamar also has almost 1,000 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns. Derrick almost has 1,800 rushing yards and 14 touchdowns. Even though he is old, he is a really great running back, and that is why I chose him as the best offensive players for the Ravens. Now, it's the defense. One person has almost 12 sacks and is looking really good. Kyle Van Noy is my pick. Like I just said, has almost 12 sacks, 11.5 to be exact. He also has a fumble recovery. The Ravens defense has been alright, but Kyle Van Noy has been good, and that is why I choose him as the best defensive player for the Ravens. The next team is the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals offense has been amazing, but their defense has been hot garbage. Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase's teamwork has earned them both the best offensive players for the Bengals. Joe has almost 4,300 passing yards and 39 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. Jamar has over 1,500 receiving yards and 16 touchdowns. They still have a small chance to get in the playoffs, but very likely. That is why I chose him as the best offensive players for the Bengals. Next is the defense. Somehow Trey Hendrickson has 13.5 sacks. He is my pick. Trey also has 2 forced fumbles. He is an amazing player, and that is a lot of sacks. That is why he is my pick as the best defensive player for the Bengals. Next team is the Cleveland Browns. The Browns are having a terrible season. It sucks because I'm also a Browns fan. Jerry Jeudy has been amazing. Jerry has over 1,050 yards receiving and 4 receiving touchdowns. Some may argue that David Njoku would be a better pick, but he only has 505 yards receiving and 1 more touchdown than Jerry Jeudy. That is why I picked Jerry Jeudy as the best offensive player for the Browns. Now, it's the defense. This is an easy pick. Myles Garrett is basically the whole defensive line. He is a beast when he's playing. He has 12 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and a blocked kick. The second place sacks leader for the Browns is Zadarius Smith with 5. That is why I chose Myles Garrett as the best defensive player for the Browns. The next team is the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers are choking the division away with 3 straight losses. Russell Wilson has been looking way better than last year. Russell has almost 2,500 passing yards and 15 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. Russell has been looking good after being from Denver. That is why I choose Russell Wilson as the best offensive player for the Steelers. Next is the defense. TJ Watt has been looking good, so he is my pick. TJ has 11.5 sacks and 6 forced fumbles. 2 of them he recovered. TJ has looked pretty good, and that is why I choose him as the best defensive player for the Steelers. The next team is the Houston Texans. Their season is the definition of mid. Even though CJ Stroud is having a worse season than last year, he is the best offensive player for the Texans. Stroud has almost 3,700 passing yards and 19 touchdowns to 12 interceptions. Yes, I know, 12 interceptions is a lot, but he has been looking pretty good, and that is why I choose him as the best offensive player for the Texans. Now, it's the defense. Once again, it is the sacks leader for the team, Danielle Hunter. Danielle Hunter has been doing good. He has 12 sacks and a forced fumble. Will Anderson Jr. would be another good pick, but he didn't make the cut. That is why I choose Danielle Hunter as the best defensive player for the Texans. Next team is the Indianapolis Colts. Their season was pretty bad, but at least Jonathan Taylor was good. Jonathan Taylor has over 1,100 rushing yards and 8 rushing touchdowns. He also has a receiving touchdown. He's looking like one of the best running backs in the NFL. That's just in my opinion. That is why Jonathan Taylor is the best offensive player for the Colts. Now, it's the defense. Zaire Franklin is my pick. Zaire is the leader in tackles for the Colts with 151. He also has 2.5 sacks and 3 forced fumbles. He is looking pretty good, and that is why I choose him as the best defensive player for the Colts. The next team is the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jags had a very bad season. The rookie Brian Thomas, though, has been looking promising. Brian has 1,088 yards and 9 receiving touchdowns. As a rookie, he is amazing. I think he has potential to be the best wide receiver for the Jags for a long time. That is why I choose him as the best offensive player for the Jaguars. Now, it's the defense. I decided to go with the sacks leader for the Jags, Travon Walker. Travon Walker has 8.5 sacks and a forced fumble, which turned into a fumble 6 by Travon himself. That is why I chose him as the best defensive player for the Jaguars. The next team is the Tennessee Titans. Their season is just as bad as the Jaguars' season. Tony Pollard has redeemed himself from last year with the Cowboys. Tony has over 1,000 rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. Last year from the Cowboys, he was terrible. This year, he has been great. That is why I choose him as the best offensive player for the Titans. Now it's the defense. I went with the interceptions leader for the Titans, Amani Hooker. Amani has 5 interceptions and 2 forced fumbles. He has been looking good. That is why I choose him as the best defensive player for the Titans. Next team is the Denver Broncos. The Broncos season has been promising. Bo Nix, the rookie, has the most promising. Bo Nix has thrown for more than 3,000 yards and 22 touchdowns to 11 interceptions. He also has 4 rushing touchdowns. He might be the future quarterback for the Broncos, and that is why I choose him as the best offensive player for the Broncos. It's the defense. I chose Brandon Jones as the best defensive player for the Broncos. Brandon is the leader in tackles for the Broncos and second in interceptions. Pat Surtain is above him in interceptions with 4. One of them is a pick 6. But he isn't as good as Brandon Jones. That is why I chose him as the best defensive player for the Broncos. The next team is the Kansas City Chiefs. They have been looking good recently. They used the dark magic and the refs to win some games, but somehow they only have 1 loss. This might be controversial, but Patrick Mahomes is the best offensive player for the Chiefs. Patrick has almost 4,000 passing yards and 26 touchdowns to 11 interceptions. Patrick Mahomes may be overrated, but he is the best offensive player for the Chiefs, unfortunately. Now it's the defense. Some may be saying Chris Jones, but I'm going for the sacks leader, George Karlaftis. George has 8 sacks, which is pretty good. Chris Jones has only 5 sacks. George has high hopes heading into the playoffs, and that is why he is the best defensive player for the Chiefs. Team is the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders have had a very bad season. They traded Davante Adams to the Jets, and a guy named Brock Bowers stepped up and was amazing. Brock Bowers is only a rookie, and he has over 1,000 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. As a rookie, he has some potential to be the best tight end in the future, and that is why I choose him as the best offensive player for the Raiders. Now, it's the defense. Max Crosby and Robert Spillane are my picks. Max Crosby is the leader in sacks on his team with 7.5. Robert is the leader in tackles with 134. He also has 2 interceptions and a sack. That is why those 2 players are the best defensive players for the Raiders. The last team in the video is the Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers have had a good season. They have a playoff berth and a great quarterback and head coach. Justin Herbert, the quarterback, is my pick. Herbert has 3,243 passing yards and 18 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions. He is amazing, and that is why I choose him as the best offensive player for the Chargers. Now, it's the defense. I choose the interceptions leader for the Chargers, Tarheeb Still. Still has 4 interceptions. One of them was a pick 6. Still also has a half of a sack. The Chargers defense is underrated, and that is why I choose Tarheeb Still as the best defensive player for the Chargers. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more NFL content. If this gets 10 likes, I will give my playoff predictions. Bye everybody and have a great day or night.